Welcome to Optimize Your Career. I'm Kim Kennedy, and I'm glad to introduce to you our host, Ed Samuel. Ed, good morning.
Good morning, Kim. Glad to be here again on Saturday.
Yes. Ed, before we kick off our new topic this morning, we did get several questions from callers from last week's program regarding the biggest mistakes made with resumes. So here is question 1. Pam from Downingtown asks, my resume is 3 pages long. I'm being told to keep it to 2 no matter what. Do I have to shrink it down?
Well, that's a question I get asked an awful lot. You know, there's no hard rule in the resume creation handbook or manual that a resume has to be 2 pages. It's really an untruth. You know, and what I worry about sometimes is that we're shrinking it down to 2 pages when in fact it really does need to be 3 pages. And even in some cases, I've helped people create 4-page resumes in the cases of PhDs who have patents and publications. But let me explain why this happens. I had hired, I want to say close to 3,000 people in my career, and I've even led a team of recruiters. And if I asked them the question, is a 2-page or, is a 3-page resume too long? Here's how they would answer it. If the first page of a resume is like a home run, then they flip to the second page and they say, well, okay, that's a really good supporting cast. And if there's a third page, there's no problem about bringing a person in for an interview. However, if the first page is like, oh, no, wow, it's a lot of detail, and then there's a second page that doesn't, that kind of just follows suit, then that third page is like way too long. So what happens is the quality of a resume is really what drives whether it's a 2 or 3 page. That's kind of rule number 1. And then rule number 2 is that there has to be a reason behind it being 3 pages. So what I'm a big fan of is just putting some thought into it. Now, here's something else I worry about where people have lack of confidence in their resume. So they just think that by shrinking it down to 2 pages, that somehow makes everything right when it doesn't. Last week on the show, I talked about having a powerful ROI on the first page of the resume. It's a powerful punch. And then we don't necessarily have to worry so much about it going to 2 pages. But I've seen people do some things really that you want to avoid. Well, my resume was 2.5 pages, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shrink the font size down. And now you can't read the resume because the font size is too small, but you got it to 2 pages. Doesn't make any sense at all. I've seen people take their awards off, their volunteer work off, and even their professional affiliations off their resume because their goal was to get it to 2 pages. And again, whoever created the resume handbook that says it has to be 2 pages, it's not true. Now, the real issue, it really boils down to what happens on that second page and the years of experience that a person has leading up to, that point in their career. And if it's going to add significantly to where this person's going now, then it's a good reason to keep that detail on a resume and keep telling that story. And don't leave it off if it's tied to what you're doing next. Now, the other problem is that for those people that have worked for one company for 30 years, and maybe they've had 5 jobs, what I see people doing also is they cut the resume off at 2 pages, and instead of showing the employer, the hiring manager, that they've worked for the company for 30 years, they'll actually stop halfway through their career, and it'll look like they only worked for that company for 15 years, when in fact, they really worked for the company for 30 years, and that's another reason that resume should be 3 pages long. And there's a case where you have to be really careful because what you're really stating on a resume is an untruth. You really worked there 30 years, not 15 years. But again, these are some reasons people are using to kind of justify getting a resume to 2 pages when I would say that's something you want to avoid. So let me give you an example of a marketing manager. They spent 10 years early on in their career as a cook for a restaurant. Well, there's a case where you wouldn't want to go to 3 pages on a resume if the person is really a marketing manager now. And it's really not going to add a lot of value by putting down the accomplishments of the cook for those first 10 years. So if you made your resume 3 pages long because you were trying to fit everything in this example, it wouldn't make any sense to provide that kind of detail and have a 3-page resume for some work that doesn't apply to what you're doing going forward. So I can make an argument in that particular case, no, leave it out. And then one last mistake made when I work with a lot of people who are consultants, and these are consulting resumes. It's just the opposite. When you're a consultant and people are bringing you in to hire you as a consultant, no problem at all having a 3-page resume, and you better list all the experience because people are paying you as a consultant for everything that you've done, not just the last 10 years or 15 years. So for consultants, I'm a big fan of laying everything out, not leaving anything off a resume. And overall, keep it to 2 pages. For the sake of keeping it to 2 pages makes no sense. It's a bad principle. It just needs to be thought through.
Okay, Ed, great response. Appreciate that. Another question from a listener, and this is Jonathan from Lancaster, who says, I've heard not, emphasis not, to put volunteer work on a resume. What do you say, Ed? And I'm wondering, Ed, if I can add on to that. Does that include work that you do in the church?
Okay. Let me take one piece of it. So in general, including volunteer work is I believe it should be on a resume. And the reason I can tell you that is because I've seen example after example. I've been in rooms with doors shut and candidates going toe to toe. It came down to 2 people. The interview team said, we love both of these people. And then we went through everything blow by blow. And wouldn't you know it, the one person did Habitat for Humanity. The other person had nothing on their resume. It was all work. The hiring manager said, we're going with the person that did Habitat with Humanity. Now, and I've seen that a lot. And one of the reasons behind that is that, are you all work? And are you not giving back anything in your life? That's one question that people will often wonder about. But are you so consumed in work that you have no other broad perspective of humanity at all? The community, helping those in need, and really insightful leaders that I've found over the years, hiring managers, including myself. I may not hire a person who lacks that larger perspective because I want that larger perspective brought into my workplace, into the employer's workplace, so they can actually be a better leader and lead teams in a way that someone who has never been exposed to that kind of volunteer work would never be able to experience. And yes, I do believe that if you're in a leadership role at a church, to include that on a resume. Now, if we have a different challenge at times too, where you don't want to take it to the extreme. The other day, I actually worked with a college student, and that college student had a list of volunteer work that they did, which was amazing. And this happens not, for working professionals as well. I've seen it in both cases, but this was just fairly recently. A college student had a list of volunteer work, which was quite amazing. The problem is the list of volunteer work was longer than the accomplishments for the 2 internships that he actually had on his resume. And then at that point, now you shoot yourself in the foot. You're actually overplaying your volunteer work when, in fact, no, you don't have to list everything. List maybe 3 things that you've done on a selected basis, and then make sure that you double up on the internship accomplishments. So you just have to be careful. But generally speaking, include the volunteer work. It shows another side of you, and I think it's a much more attractive side.
Interesting. Very interesting take on that, Ed. Okay, here's our last question. This one is from Sue from Norristown. Ed, I had a resume service, bold keywords on my resume. It feels odd to see the bold. Should I keep the bold on my resume?
Well, let me give you a bold answer. As a rule, in talking to many hiring managers, recruiters, social media marketing experts, I think bold is generally a bad move. Because what bold really does on a resume, it's basically telling the reader, I don't want you to read my whole resume. I don't want you to kind of take it all in. I'm going to tell you which keywords to look at because I'm gravely concerned either, you can't read or I really have to point you to things on my resume. And I just think it's a distraction as a rule. And I'm not necessarily a fan. And I don't think, I can't count on one hand on a 500 resumes that I've done where I've done a bold maybe once or twice because my client begged me to. And even then I should have said no. So I think it just takes away from the context of the bolding.
I agree with you. I was always told that caps and bolding is like yelling at people, and I don't want to give them the wrong impression. Well, those are great questions, great answers. Listeners, keep them coming. Send them to info@1180wfoil.com, and we'll be sure that Ed gets them.
Well, let's move on now. We're going to hit on a different topic, and this is about leveraging your personality during an interview. And why does it matter? Well, I could just talk from real life experience that 1 out of every 15 of the clients we work with, when they go in for an interview, they're asked to do a personality assessment. In fact, there's a firm in Lancaster. I know the president very well. He will never hire an employee unless they do a personality assessment. And he sees it as absolutely critical to the hiring process, and that he wants to understand where that person's personality will fit in terms of where they will fit in terms of the team they're going to be placed on. And that's important in the final decision. And many other companies do the same. Now, the other reason you want to do an assessment as part of companies do an assessment, they'll do it as part of a pre-screen. In other words, you won't even go in for an interview unless the assessment's completed. Another assessment is done as the next step. In other words, you don't go in for that second interview unless the assessment's done. And there are some firms, believe it or not, that are ready to make a job offer, and they're going to ask you to do a personality assessment as the condition of the job offer being actually made. And 85% of the time, when people fill out those assessments, they will never see the results. Not from HR, not from the employer. And somehow it always, I don't like that, because it leads the employer then has that another upper hand on the candidate that's applying for the job. Now, most people are curious, and you also want to be able to anticipate the questions they might ask you. So I'm a big fan of making sure that if you're in the job market and you're starting to pursue employment elsewhere, do a personality assessment. Do it. It doesn't cost a lot of money to do at all. But what that does is that it gives you opportunity to prep yourself for an interview. You're going to see a version of you that they're going to most likely see on the assessment tool they're using. And now you're going to be so much better prepared on the areas that they may poke at. So we have an assessment it's a proprietary tool that we use. I'm certified in it. It's a DISC personality ID assessment, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Now let's look at another reason why your personality is so pivotal to interviewing. You know, everyone's unique. I'm a big believer, the good Lord created us in a certain way, and a part of your core gets crystallized early on. And I read reports, 7, 8 years old, it's done. It's set in concrete in terms of who you are. And yet there's other reports that I've read where your personality can develop over time. But at some point you become who you are, and your personality is a major part of your success in your career. It's kind of like pistons in an engine that's driving you. Those pistons are part of your personality. It's not only how smart you are. It's not because you went to school and you learned something. But when you go to implement something, when you go and you make these accomplishments, it's because of your personality. It's who you are. That's the driver that made it happen. So during an interview, I always ask, I'm always worried that one of my clients are going to be asked a pointed question. So, what are the strengths of your personality? Now, whether it's legal or not, that's a different question, but I want you to be ready for it. And you'd be surprised, 90% of the people that I work with, when I ask them that question, and I work with hundreds and hundreds of people, they can't answer that question. Or they look at me and it's a minute later, well, I think it's this. And that's not good, because you're in an interview. You want to be able to give somebody a crisp, strong answer as to who you are. That bodes very well for you when you're interviewing. Now, a lot of times what will happen is that when I ask that question, what's the strength of your personality, what I'll get back is I have high integrity. I work hard. I love work-life balance. But all those things are values. They have nothing to do with your personality. So they would get that wrong if that was their answer to the question. Another question that a firm in Exton, Pennsylvania, there's a firm, they love this question. Hey, and they always ask at the end of the interview. So we just spent some time together. Give me one word that summarizes your personality. Just one word. What is it? And again, you don't want to get caught if you're ever asked that question. So let's take a look at some questions that I really want to ask you and I really want you to think about when it comes to your personality. And what I want to do is I want to kind of just go through these one by one just to get you thinking. So if I was to ask you, are you the directing type? Are you more assertive? Are you more decisive? Are you more controlling? Or are you more adaptive? Are you more pliable? Are you more conforming? A bit more passive? So there's a scale. You're either one or the other. Where would you really put your personality in that ranking? High, low, medium? Well, here's another one. Are you the interacting type? You outgoing? Do you communicate? Are you excitable? Or are you really reserved? Are you really introverted? Are you quiet? Are you somewhat distant? Are you modest? That's a personality trait. And again, are you scoring high or low? Where are you on that assessment? Here's one more. Are you supportive? Is that generally your nature, to be supportive? Are you harmonious? Do you have a patient streak in you? Are you lenient with people? Or are you pretty objective? You know, hey, I'm going to question things. I'm going to be a bit impatient. I'm going to be a bit critical. I like to say when people are that objective, it's usually just the facts. And sometimes, CFOs, because I'm a former CFO, I would be accused of that at times. Take the emotion out. Just give me the numbers. It's either black or white. And then one more for you to think about. Are you conscientious? Are you detailed-oriented? Are you precision-driven? Are you kind of that perfectionist type of person? Or are you unconventional? You have this imaginative streak, in you. You're spontaneous. You're not, you kind of want to go with the flow as it's happening. And again, are you scoring yourself high or are you scoring yourself low? Now, this is just one example of a series of questions you want to be able to take on an assessment and then have the answers to those going into an interview. You'll be so much better prepared. And you may end up with this one word that people are asking you about that, hey, what's a good summary of who you are? You might be a networker. You might be a director. What type of personality, are you overall? But then what happens is most of these assessment reports, whether it be the ones that I'm certified in or others that I'm certified in, they're going to basically try to hit you up on some areas that, okay, well, based on this assessment report, here are the areas of strength that you have. Based on this assessment report, here are areas of struggle that you have. And it's the struggle piece that I worry about, because then if the employer is doing one of these assessments ahead of you, you go in for the interview, what do you think they might ask you questions about? Areas, right? Areas about where you might have struggles. But now you have, you see it coming. And that's why, when you see it coming, you're much better prepared to answer those questions when they're posed at you. A few other areas that you might get asked about is, based on your personality type, how will you contribute to an organization? What's your overall leadership style? Are you task-oriented or people-oriented? When it comes to the issues around, are you flexible? How do you deal with stress? One of the and many assessment tools will actually summarize and say, okay, if you were to hire this person, here's what we're going to suggest you really focus on, because based on all the information for people with this type of personality type, here are some suggestions we're making to you, manager, about this potential employee that you're going to hire. And they get to read that and they get to think about it. one of the things that we do in our assessment, which I love, is that we actually take 18 blended profiles in this proprietary tool, and we will actually align people to historical figures. So everyone who does an assessment gets pegged to a person in history that actually matches their personality. So it's pretty neat.
I love that. That's a great idea.
But it is gender neutral. So when I did it, I'm Madame Curie. So I just want, that's the way it turned out. And I have her personality traits. And then I leverage them when I'm asked the question about my personality strengths. It's pretty interesting. Now, I guess what I want to do is I want to talk about how do you wind down or how do you take an assessment? If you take a DISC assessment with Sam Nova, with my organization, it's under $50. It includes a 15 to 20-minute set of questions. You'll get a 6-page report and maybe 15, 20 minutes with me on the phone to review those results. And that's kind of what an assessment might do with somebody, a professional like myself, a career coach, that can kind of walk you through it and tie it into how you interview. You could certainly go online and do a free assessment or other assessments, but those are the ones that we do. I highly recommend it. So let's just do a recap of what we talked about this morning. Do a personality assessment. Even if you only do it once in your lifetime, just get it done. But especially if you're in job search mode, so you are giving more an advantage going into an interview, especially if those questions are posed to you. Don't let that HR manager, hiring team get that upper hand. Since it's you, give yourself an equal edge, because you're talking about yourself and you need to know who you are going into an interview. Talk to your strengths of your personality. It's a huge reason as to why you have been so successful in your career. Those pistons that drive you is a big part of your success. And one added benefit of doing the assessment is that you can do this assessment for yourself, and then we could do it with your significant other in your life, your spouse, your teammates, and then come and create what we call a combined personality assessment. So as we close today, if you want your resume reviewed at no cost, please email your resume to resume@samnovainc, SAMNOVAINC.com. On our next program of Optimize Your Career on Saturday, August 4th, we will be discussing the benefits of attending networking forums and a few pitfalls along the way. We'll have a special guest, the president of a unique and fast-growing networking forum in the Pennsylvania area, who has helped a large number of people land jobs, and it's built on the principle called networking for life. This again is Ed Samuel, career coach with Sam Nova. Our website is www.samnova.com. So long for now, and God bless.